Behind the iron gates, the cameras are already waiting. It is January 2017, and the man who once commanded 25,000 followers from a stage that looked more like a concert arena than a pulpit is dying inside a Lithonia, Georgia mansion that cost more than most of his congregation would earn in a lifetime. The gold cross is already laid out, the off-white robe is already pressed, and buried inside the walls of that estate, inside the contracts, the bank accounts, the legal filings, the locked rooms of a carefully managed mythology, is something nobody in that congregation has been allowed to see. Bishop Eddie Long did not just leave behind a legacy, he left behind a bill. And when the federal government finally knocked, the address on the envelope was the same address where the faithful had sent their tithes for 30 years. Here is the detail almost everyone misses about Eddie Long. The scandal most people remember, the lawsuits, the young men, the photographs, the settlement, was not the end of the story. It was not even the worst part. The worst part came after the silence, after the carefully worded denials, after the purple robe and the crown, after the death, after the funeral, after the flowers wilted and the cameras moved on. The worst part came when a federal lien appeared in a Georgia courthouse naming a dead bishop and his grieving widow, demanding $335,216. And that document, dry and bureaucratic as it was, did something that years of accusations, protests, and press conferences had never quite managed to do. It made the faithful stop and look directly at what had been built in God's name and ask themselves what exactly they had been financing. But to understand what was found inside that mansion, inside that life, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the scripture, to the wound underneath the scripture. Eddie Long was born in 1953 in Farmville, North Carolina, the son of a Baptist minister. He grew up watching his father command a room with nothing but his voice and the authority of belief. And somewhere in that childhood observation, Eddie Long learned the most dangerous lesson a gifted man can learn too early. He learned that persuasion is power. He learned that a congregation is not just a community, it is an instrument. And if you know how to play it, it will give you everything: money, loyalty, insulation from consequence, and the most intoxicating thing of all, which is the certainty that God is on your side. That lesson did not make him a monster in childhood. It made him a survivor. It made him sharp. It gave him a framework for ambition in a world that offered black men from North Carolina very narrow doorways. The problem was not the lesson. The problem was what he did with it when nobody was watching. Eddie Long graduated from North Carolina Central University, spent years in corporate sales, and somewhere between a Ford Motor Company desk job and the pulpit, decided that the church was where his particular gifts would pay the highest return. He joined New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia in 1987 as senior pastor and found a congregation of around 300 people. Within a decade, New Birth had grown to more than 20,000 members. By the early 2000s, that number had climbed to 25,000. Eddie Long had not just built a church, he had built a brand. And like every great American brand, it was built on an image. The image was specific and intentional. Long was not the quiet, scholarly theologian. He was the warrior bishop, the man who wore tailored Nehru suits that cost thousands of dollars, the man who drove Bentleys and Rolls-Royces, the man who flew on private jets and preached prosperity gospel with the conviction of a man who genuinely believed that God's favor could be measured in the square footage of your home. Stop here for a moment, because this is where the psychology becomes important. The prosperity gospel that Long preached was not simply theology, it was architecture. It built a world in which his wealth was proof of his righteousness, which meant questioning his wealth was questioning his righteousness, which meant questioning God. It is one of the most elegant self-sealing systems ever constructed inside a house of worship, because every external challenge, the skeptics, the journalists, the dissenters, could be absorbed and neutralized by the framework itself. If critics questioned his Bentley, the answer was already built into the sermon: "You are not spiritually mature enough to understand what God has given me." If members quietly wondered why the church's money seemed to flow so generously toward the pastor's comfort, the answer was already pre-packaged and delivered from the stage on Sunday morning: "You have to plant a seed to receive a harvest." And tens of thousands of people planted seeds every week for decades. New Birth was not simply a church by the early 2000s. It was a campus, a corporation, and a cultural institution inside the Black community of DeKalb County, Georgia. Long performed the funeral service of Coretta Scott King in 2006 at New Birth, with 4 sitting presidents in attendance. He had met with heads of state. He had been photographed with senators and governors. He had written books, launched multimedia empires that made New Birth's annual revenues reach into the tens of millions of dollars. The man had access to power that most pastors could not dream of, and he wore that access the way other men wear expensive watches, as a signal, a warning, and an invitation all at once. And inside that empire, quietly, in programs that operated under the pastoral umbrella, were young men. This is where the story turns, and it turns hard.
Long had established a mentorship initiative within New Birth known as the Long Fellows Youth Academy, a program intended to guide and support young men from the congregation. According to public reports and court filings, Long developed close relationships with some participants and their families, often serving as a mentor and influential figure in their lives. In 2010, 4 former participants, Anthony Flagg, Spencer Legrand, Jamal Paris, and Maurice Robinson, filed civil lawsuits raising concerns about the nature of those relationships. The plaintiffs alleged that Long provided gifts, travel opportunities, financial assistance, jewelry, and vehicles, and that these benefits were connected to relationships they later described as inappropriate. The lawsuits further claimed that Long used his position of influence and spiritual authority in ways that affected their ability to challenge or question the relationship dynamics. Long denied wrongdoing, and the allegations were never tested in a criminal court. According to the court filings, some of the plaintiffs believed the relationships had been presented to them in spiritual or religious terms. Anthony Flagg stated in his complaint that he had been told the relationship was acceptable in the eyes of God. Maurice Robinson described international trips that he said were funded through church-related resources. Jamal Paris publicly criticized Long during media interviews in 2010, expressing deep emotional distress and frustration regarding his experiences. Paris appeared on camera during that period and spoke openly about the impact the situation had on him. Despite the controversy, many members of the church community continued to support Long. In September 2010, shortly after the lawsuits became public, Long addressed his congregation during a widely viewed church service. Standing before the congregation, he stated, "I have never in my life portrayed myself as a perfect man, but I am not the man that's being portrayed on the television. That's not me. That's not me." He told the congregation he intended to fight the allegations and compared his circumstances to the biblical story of David and Goliath. The congregation responded with applause and support. Observers later noted that Long's remarks focused on his public image and his response to the accusations rather than directly addressing each allegation outlined in the lawsuits. For supporters, the speech was a declaration of resilience. For critics, it left significant questions unanswered. In 2011, all 4 civil lawsuits were settled out of court. The settlement terms were confidential, and no admission of liability was publicly reported. No criminal charges were filed. Long remained senior pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, and the church continued its operations despite the controversy.
Yet the lawsuits were only one part of a broader discussion surrounding Long and New Birth. Questions about finances and compensation had surfaced years earlier. In 2005, reporting by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution examined Long's compensation package, which reportedly included salary, housing benefits, transportation allowances, and other forms of support provided through the church. The reports generated public debate about financial transparency, leadership compensation, and accountability within large religious organizations. Long responded to such criticism by defending his leadership and continuing his ministry. Supporters argued that his compensation reflected the scale of his work and influence, while critics questioned whether such benefits aligned with the expectations many people have of religious leadership. Some scholars and observers of religious organizations have pointed to dynamics that can emerge in highly centralized institutions, where leaders may hold significant influence over both organizational culture and members' personal lives. In such environments, loyalty to leadership and loyalty to the institution can become closely connected, making criticism or disagreement difficult for some members. Supporters of New Birth often describe the church as a source of community, purpose, and spiritual guidance. Critics argued that strong loyalty structures can sometimes make it challenging for organizations to confront internal controversies openly. These debates became part of the larger public conversation surrounding New Birth during and after the lawsuits. For many families connected to the church, the situation was deeply complicated. The church represented more than a place of worship. It was a community, a support network, and a central part of daily life. As a result, the allegations and the public attention surrounding them created difficult questions for members who were trying to reconcile competing narratives about a leader they had trusted. Following the 2011 settlement, Long's public image evolved. Supporters described this period as a time of reflection and personal change. He adopted a different appearance, including growing his hair into long locks before later cutting it during a symbolic ceremony at New Birth. He also reconciled with his wife, Vanessa, after a period of separation, and the couple publicly renewed their commitment to one another in 2015. Many supporters viewed these developments as evidence of personal growth and renewal. In 2016, Long announced that he had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Members of the congregation and the broader public could see the physical effects of the illness as his health declined. The once commanding figure appeared noticeably weakened as he continued to address his congregation. Eddie Long died on January 15, 2017. His funeral was held at New Birth Missionary Baptist Church and attended by thousands. Religious leaders, community figures, and church members gathered to reflect on his decades of ministry, community outreach, and influence. The service was broadcast publicly and highlighted the lasting impact he had on many people throughout his career. For supporters, the ceremony celebrated a leader whose ministry touched countless lives. For critics, it also served as a reminder of the controversies that remained part of his legacy. As with many influential public figures, assessments of Eddie Long's life continue to be shaped by both his accomplishments and the debates that surrounded him.
Months after Eddie Long was buried, a federal tax lien was filed in DeKalb County, Georgia, naming the estate of Bishop Eddie L. Long and his widow, Vanessa Long, and demanding $335,216. The Internal Revenue Service does not file liens for small oversights. A lien of this size, filed against the estate of a man who led a multi-million-dollar religious organization, suggests a significant gap between what was owed to the federal government and what had actually been paid. Let that sit for a moment. The man who preached that wealth was proof of God's favor, the man who told his congregation that if you sowed enough seed into the ministry, you would reap a supernatural harvest,
The man who drove off the lot of a Bentley dealership while facing federal questions. That man left behind a tax debt of more than $300,000 that would now follow his widow into her grief. Vanessa Long has not commented publicly in detail about the lien. According to reports, she faced additional financial pressures after Eddie's death, including questions about the estate's assets and liabilities. New Birth itself underwent significant financial and organizational contraction after Long's passing. Membership declined, revenue declined. The infrastructure of a 25,000-member church does not sustain itself on legacy alone. And then there were the other voices, the voices that had been waiting. After Long died, additional allegations began surfacing publicly. A man named Christopher Sasser came forward in 2019, claiming that he had been sexually abused by Long beginning when he was 17 years old, describing a pattern remarkably consistent with what the 2010 plaintiffs had described: gifts, travel, the framing of the relationship as spiritually sanctioned, the use of biblical language to normalize contact. Sasser's account added a detail that sharpens the picture of everything that came before. He described Long telling him that what they were doing was special and between them and God. Between them and God. That phrase is the key to the entire mechanism. Because if the relationship is between you and God, then exposing it is not just betraying a man, it is betraying God. And the threat of divine abandonment for a 17-year-old boy embedded in a totalistic religious community is not abstract, it is everything. Here is the question that lingers, and it is not a comfortable one. How many people inside New Birth Missionary Baptist Church knew enough to ask serious questions before 2010 and chose not to? Not because they were evil, but because the cost of knowing was too high. The institution protected itself through the faith of people who genuinely believed, who were genuinely helped by that faith, and who could not or would not extend their knowledge to its logical conclusion. This is how institutions survive their own worst moments, not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary human preference for comfort over confrontation. And the families of the young men, the mothers who handed their sons to a man they called bishop, the fathers who were grateful for the mentorship, the brothers and sisters who watched their family members be pulled into Long's orbit and interpreted that closeness as blessing. What is the right word for what they paid? Not a settlement, not a lien, something older and harder than either of those things. There is one more detail inside that Lithonia mansion that deserves attention before this story closes. The mansion itself, the estate at the center of the 2005 Atlanta Journal-Constitution investigation, the home that New Birth's finances helped purchase, was reported to be worth approximately $1.1 to $1.4 million, depending on the accounting period. It had been provided to Long as part of his compensation package from the church, a tax-exempt organization, which means the faithful tithing members of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church effectively paid for their pastor's home while being told that the size of their faith could be measured by the size of their offering. The irony does not require elaboration, but it does require honesty. The story of Eddie Long is, in the end, not simply the story of a man who betrayed a trust. It is the story of a system that allowed betrayal to be indistinguishable from blessing for years, sometimes decades. It is the story of what happens when an institution's need for survival becomes more powerful than its members' need for truth. It is the story of what kinds of power do to the people who hold them. How the insulation grows, how the accountability dissolves, how the line between genuine belief and ruthless manipulation can become genuinely blurry even to the person on the inside. But it is also the story of Christopher Sasser, who waited years before speaking because speaking felt like losing God. It is the story of Jamal Paris sobbing in front of a camera and telling the world what was done to him in the name of Scripture, It is the story of 4 young men who were told that their suffering was consecrated and who eventually decided that it was not. Go back to the beginning, back to the iron gates, back to the off-white robe and the gold cross, back to the federal lien sitting in a Georgia courthouse, dry and clean and completely indifferent to the mythology surrounding the man it named. What was found inside Bishop Eddie Long's mansion was not just tax debt or evidence of a lavish lifestyle built on the tithes of the faithful, or the shadow of allegations that never fully resolved. What was found inside that mansion, if you look carefully enough, is something much older and much more ordinary than any of it. It is the record of what happens when the most dangerous kind of power, the power that wears the face of God, is given to a man who has confused his own desire with divine mandate. It happens quietly, it happens gradually, and by the time the documents surface and the liens are filed and the voices finally speak, the man who built the walls is already gone. And the people left inside those walls are still trying to figure out what they were really living inside.